So, you want to be an it girl? Okay, hi guys, and welcome back to Confessions of a Wannabe It Girl. Today I am joined by Sadie. She is a mental health teen advocate and the host of She Persisted Podcast. Sadie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
I'm so excited to talk to you. I have to say, when I found first your content and then your podcast, I am blown away by how you manage this all, how open and honest you are with your own experiences, like on the mic, and the really intelligent questions you ask your guests. So I want to go back a little bit, like, why, before you started the podcast, like, why did you feel like this was an important space for you to talk about?
Yeah, so going back to my freshman year of high school, I was really at like rock bottom is how I would describe it. I was suicidally depressed. I was struggling a lot with anxiety. I had been struggling with those feelings, diagnoses, emotions, however you want to describe it, for probably a couple years at that point, and had tried everything locally. My parents were really great about looking for resources and getting me help when I needed it, but nothing was really working. So I had tried like outpatient therapy, inpatient stays, DBT, CBT, family therapy, psychotherapy, anything you can imagine. I had tried it and nothing was working. I was still really struggling with the suicidal depression, all of this anxiety. There was a lot of behaviors that had popped up, whether it was codependent relationships or self-harm or eating disordered behaviors, all of these different things that were different ways that this suffering, this pain were presenting. And I was just trying to communicate that I wasn't okay, that something didn't feel right. And I just didn't know how to do that. So flash forward to freshman year of high school, my treatment team and my parents kind of realized that something has to change. I was pretty much backed into a corner in that I couldn't go back to my outpatient DBT program. I'd just been hospitalized for the fourth time in a year. And I had tried everything and nothing was working. I'd done intensive outpatient twice. I'd done this outpatient DBT twice. I tried all of these different things. And again, these like behaviors and emotions were still popping up. And so the next step from there was intensive treatment. And so my parents did a ton of research and they tried to figure out what is the best treatment for teenage girls that are struggling with depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation and self-harm. They came across this therapy called DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy. And it's an evidence-based treatment for a lot of things. It works for adolescents that are struggling with depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. It was initially developed for adults struggling with borderline personality disorder. It's now been shown to help with OCD and eating disorders and all of these different things, a huge spectrum of diagnoses and behaviors, but it really teaches you how to manage emotional distress, how to regulate yourself, and how to build your life worth living. And so there's these different modules: mindfulness, emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. And those are really the 4 pillars of being effective in life. And if you are living a life where you're like, things feel pretty good, I don't feel like I'm struggling, you're probably using a lot of these skills. But when you're struggling so much, you tend to really depart from this way of functioning effectively. You are trying to get validation, you're trying to get support, you're trying to communicate that you're not okay in really effective manners. And that's what happened to me. So DBT allowed me to kind of go back to that baseline effective functioning and learn how to have a relationship with my parents and manage my depression and understand my anxiety and be in the moment rather than so focused on all these other possibilities and all these different things. But this DBT program that I went to was at McLean Hospital, which is a mental hospital right outside of Boston. And you might have heard of it from Girl Interrupted, which is what it's that movie is based on, that hospital. It's been around forever. It used to be an asylum. So me as like a 14-year-old high schooler Googling like McLean Hospital, I was like, where am I going? I was absolutely terrified. Selena Gomez actually went there around the same time that I did, which is super awesome. And now she is a huge advocate for DBT. Rare Beauty donates a ton of funds to McLean Hospital, and some of the doctors there are on the board of Rare Beauty. So tons of cool different celebrity and just like pop culture things that have to do with McLean because it's such a big hospital and has been around for so long. But my parents found this program. It's the best in the country for DBT for adolescent girls. And they were like, this is what's happening. Didn't want to go. I didn't think it was going to work. I remember we flew across the country. I packed all my stuff up and I was told 4 to 6 weeks. So I was like, okay, 4 to 6 weeks. I can do that. I'll go back to freshman year of high school. It'll be fine. And we got there and we did this intake meeting, and you sit with probably like 10 or 12 different clinicians, whether it's social workers, psychiatrists, therapists, educators, the other people that they're like grad students that want to go into psychology, but they're the ones that you spend the majority of your day with. So all of these different individuals were in this room, and the first question that they ask you is, do you want to be here? Well, first they said, do you want your parents to be in the room? I was like, absolutely not. No. I was like, yeah, they've just flown across the country. They're dedicating themselves and my time to do this like insane program. And I was like, nope, this is their fault. I really had it in my mind that I was 13, I was 14. Like I hadn't had the opportunity to go off on my own and build my own life. So if this version of my life was filled with so much pain, it must be their fault. Like they raised me. This must be a wrongdoing on their end. And so all of that suffering, really, I placed a lot of blame on them, on their parenting, all of that kind of stuff. And so kicked them out. They went and sat in the hall. And then the next question was, do you want to be here? And I was very clear in my answer to that. I was like, no, I don't. I've done DBT before. I know it's not going to work. I understand that it works for other people. I understand that other people have the capacity to be happy and love life and not be depressed, but that's just not in the cards for me. And I was 14 at that point, and I was fully looking at like all of these Harvard medical school affiliated clinicians and being like, no, can't help me.
I like love the balls of that though. Like you were like, no, this is what I think.
Yeah. Oh, such a mess. But they were like, in the nicest way possible, they were like, okay, here's the thing. Every single girl that you see here wants to be here. She's chosen to be here. She is dedicated to trying to get better. She sees the wisdom in the treatment program, and wisdom is a big thing in DBT. It's like that balance of the emotional side of things. So being emotionally invested, trusting people to help you, and the logical side of things, understanding that there's dozens of studies proving the effectiveness that these skills work. These clinicians have helped hundreds of girls. And so finding the wisdom was really important for me to be a patient there. Then they also were like, but there's a lot of programs that don't work this way. And there's a lot of programs that don't need adolescent consent to give treatment. And your parents can take you to one of those places if you don't want to be here. And I really love that they're so big on that willingness and that consent piece for teens, because it's not a standard across the industry. And it's what I think made the biggest difference for me, because prior to that point, I'd gone through the motions of all of these different therapies and treatment programs and DBT twice before, but I never believed that it would work. I never trusted the clinicians to help me, and I never wanted to get better. There was no self-compassion. There was no, you know what, maybe it would be good if I felt happy and I loved my life and I had things I looked forward to and relationships I enjoyed. Like I had so much self-hatred that I didn't even want that for myself. So to start this program, I kind of had to see the wisdom in it. I had to trust these clinicians and then have that little ounce of self-compassion. Whereas like maybe like in a really far off possibility, I could be happy. And I guess that would be okay. I guess maybe I'd want that for myself if it's even possible. And so I ended up being at that program for 14 weeks. I thought I was going to be there for 4. I was there for a lot longer than that. And I did so much work during my time there, whether it was just learning skills of how to cope with the emotions that arose and my relationships and asking for help and all of these different things that just hadn't really been in my toolbox prior. I unpacked a lot of the different beliefs I was operating by, which were that I didn't believe I was deserving of love. I didn't think I would ever be good enough for my parents. I didn't think that I was deserving of being happy. And it like even more so that I would never not be depressed. So really understanding where those came from and how they were impacting my functioning and my relationships. And then towards the end, there was kind of a question of what's the next step. And there was an option to maybe go home. But going back to the environment that before had such a mess for me, my parents, my treatment team were like, we don't love that idea because I'd made so much progress in those 14 weeks, but it really wasn't like I'd have time to stabilize that over a long period of time. And I was trying to find a sleep study, some test I'd gotten run during my time at McLean a couple weeks ago, and I was looking through my notes, and there was one point, like towards the end of it, where I told my therapist, I was like, "I'm done with my mental health journey. Like I'm done with therapy. I'm ready to go home. Like I'm done with treatment." And she like put that in the notes, and I was like, "Oh boy, if only you knew," because this journey is just never over. But I really thought I was done. Like I'd done a complete 180. I was no longer suicidally depressed. I was no longer just like completely overwhelmed by these anxieties and panic attacks. I had a foundation of a relationship with my parents. I felt like I kind of understood what was going on and had a little bit of a hold on this whole thing. But I ended up doing a therapeutic boarding school program for 14 months after that to kind of maintain that progress. And then towards the end of that was when I started the podcast. And the idea of the podcast had been planted by my dad when I started intensive treatment. And we were in that first initial intake meeting, and he was like, "Sadie, just think of how inspiring this journey will be. Like, think about how many teenage girls struggle, and this would just be so hopeful." And here I was, like, suicidally depressed, blaming him for everything that had ever happened, like, hating the world. And I was like, absolutely not. But not only that, I was mortified because he was like asking all these 12 clinicians who I was going to be literally like living with. He was like, "Can she have a microphone here? She's going to do a podcast." And I was like, "No, I am not. I'm not doing a podcast. Like, don't even think about it." So he brought up that idea initially. I was like, not a chance. There's no way. I didn't see it panning out in a way where I was no longer depressed. I didn't even want to tell my story. I didn't see any sense of like purpose in it. But at the end of my time at the therapeutic boarding school, I had this moment where I was like, wow, like I haven't been depressed in a really long time. Like it's been months since I felt depressed. I haven't been suicidal in over a year. I feel really good about my life. I'm living my life worth living. And I guess it is possible. And so many adults had said that to me during my journey, that things will change. It's possible to feel better, to not be depressed, to live your life worth living. But that was really hard to identify with because I was like, you're an adult. You have so much autonomy over your life. Like you just don't get it. I don't have any control. It's not possible. And so when I realized that I had done that complete 180, I was like, I got to tell people about this. Like, this is amazing. So I was kind of like, how can I tell this story? And the medium of which to do that, I was like, everyone has a YouTube channel. Don't really love that idea. I could write, but it didn't seem super appealing. Like a blog kind of felt outdated. And then I went back to this idea my dad had about a podcast. I'd never even picked up a microphone before. The only podcasts I listened to were like true crime and Call Her Daddy. So it was like definitely not like I was immersed in this space, a big range. But yeah, so I was like, I guess I'll try this. And I started recording my story. I started interviewing my friends at the therapeutic boarding school and trying to paint this picture of teen mental health and what it looks like from the outside, what we wish we would have done differently. Because I was someone who shielded my emotions and my feelings from this suffering for so long. And I also knew after learning all these skills that so much of my suffering could have been preventable. And so there was a big sense of like drive and purpose there to share that with other teens. And so I started sharing my story, started sharing other people's stories. And I think I probably got to like 10 episodes talking about myself. And I was like, I can't do this. I can't keep talking about myself every single week. And so I kind of broadened the scope and did more dialectical behavioral therapy education. I did more interviews with other subject matter experts to try and create this resource that I wished I would have had. I wish my parents wish they would have had, because there was no roadmap of like, you tried DPT this many times, you do intensive outpatient this many times, you do this many hospital stays, and then you go to the residential, then you go to the therapeutic boarding school. Like there's no trajectory, there's no roadmap. No one is talking about how to go through the process. So I really tried to create that resource. And I go back to the 3 reasons why I created the podcast, and what I try and remember is like why I'm doing this is that being that teen, not an adult, being a teen who's been exactly where listeners have been and done the exact work that they're doing, and telling them that it's okay, you can get through this. And I've done this myself because I didn't have a single teen say that to me, someone that was fully recovered, fully on the other side of the suffering, being like, this is possible, and I'm living proof of that. So that was one thing. The other thing was that I had access to so many amazing resources, clinicians, education, therapists, which I know so many teens don't have access to or don't need access to. Like, I was really struggling, and it had completely derailed my life. And yet these skills, these things I was learning could have been implemented much earlier. So I wanted to share what I learned during the year and a half in treatment. And then lastly, why am I forgetting my third pillar?
That's okay. That happens.
It's gonna come to me.
Okay.
Definitely gonna come to me.
Okay.
Resources. I don't even know what it is. I've said this so many times and now I can't remember. But yeah, I really just wanted to create the resource. I really just wanted to create the resource that I wish I had, and the reminder that it's okay, it's so possible, and make that accessible to teens. So we're now 110 episodes in. It's been 4 years since I was in intensive treatment. And we're coming up on almost exactly 4 years since I released the first podcast episode, which had no listeners. It was like 12 of me downloading it myself. And I remember I actually got in trouble for releasing the podcast because I was in this therapeutic boarding school in the middle of nowhere, Montana. And we weren't allowed phones. We had these like super locked Chromebooks. Like maybe you could get on Google. Like that was a stretch. And I like fully was on like Anchor releasing these episodes, sharing like these super detailed, like no privacy bared mental health stories. And they were like, what would possibly go through your mind that you were like, yeah, this is allowed. Like we can't listen to music, but you can release this podcast. And so definitely had a bit of a talking to there, but I was just
what
so
did you say?
Like, I was like, I don't even know what I said. I was like, my dad said I should do this. I totally threw him under the bus. I was like, this was his idea. Take it up with him. But no, I just felt so compelled to share my story. I knew it was so important. I knew I had to do it from the beginning. And I was so bad at it. Like, I always tell everyone, don't listen to the beginning episodes. Like, the audio is bad. The interviewing is bad. But I was just so compelled to share my story and try and help other teens. And even now, like, I remember when I had just gotten out of that place of rock bottom, and prior to that, there was like, why did I go through this? There was no reason. Like, what did I possibly do to deserve this much pain and suffering? And then on the other side, I was like, this is why. Like, I would go through this again if I could just help one teen and prevent them from suffering as much as I did. So there was that huge sense of purpose. And then once I started applying to colleges, but at first was like, I'm going to be a pediatric surgeon. I always knew I wanted to help people. Mm-hmm. I liked the like kind of that hospital-y setting, but I took AP chemistry, was so bad at it. I hated it with every ounce of my being. And that was part of it. And then I was like, hey, maybe I should do this mental health thing, because I always thought that I would never be able to work in the mental health field because it would be too raw. It would bring up too many emotions. Like I would just get triggered and revert back to where I was. But I was like, wait, I've been having these conversations every single week for a year now. I do spend so much extra time and energy talking and thinking about mental health in a really healthy way. It hasn't caused me to completely relapse. And so I was like, this is what I want to do. And I was able to showcase what I'd done with the podcast and share this is what I'm so passionate about. I just want to continue to further the resources I can give to teens. And so when it came time to apply to colleges, I was like, this is the path. I want to be a clinical psychologist. I want to keep doing the podcast. And I'm so passionate about this. So it really did come full circle. Now I'm going into my sophomore year at the University of Pennsylvania, studying psychology and keep chugging along with the podcast. But yeah.
Oh, there's so many things I want to ask you, but first off, I hope you're insanely proud of yourself because you've taken on a lot. Good. I love that you owned that. Because you've been through a lot, you've used it to redirect yourself in a place to continue to operate from a place of passion. I do want to ask, like, you know, you were in at the boarding school when you released the podcast the first time. So what did that feel like? Because I feel like we talk a lot about social media and, you know, being public. Like, were you even thinking about like the perception? Were you worried? Walk us through how you felt about that. Or were you so at the point you were just like, I'm ready to share?
So it was kind of interesting. I hadn't told anyone really where I was or what had happened. My close friends knew that I was in treatment, but I just kind of dropped off the face of the planet. And there wasn't really any explanation for where I'd gone. And so when I started the podcast, I was just releasing it and not promoting it at all. And then when I did start promoting it, I had this podcast account. And you look back at those posts, there was no face. I had this like really cringy, like back of the head holding the microphone, like Sadie Sutton podcasting. But it gave me this bubble in which to get really good at telling my story in a way that resonated, in a way that people connected with, that wasn't like trauma vulnerability dumping. It wasn't putting all this pain and suffering on someone else and expecting them to validate me for us. It was in a way that I felt like this is helping someone. This is reminding them that healing is possible. Healing is so doable. These are the steps you can take. This is what worked for me. And so I got to get really good at telling that story. And I didn't share the podcast with my general community, like posting about it on my normal Instagram for a year. I took a year to get good at telling that story, to feel confident in the episodes I was putting out, because again, I knew I was bad at the beginning. Like I was so passionate about what I was saying. I loved it. I would like edit on my iPod Touch on iMovie, and again, this crazy therapeutic boarding school. But I knew that it wasn't like good. Like I would listen to it, but like it wasn't like, oh, I want everyone in my entire community to just sit in a stadium and listen to me do this podcast. Now I'd be it would be uncomfortable, but I would be like, I'm confident in this. Like I could bear it. I could do some distress tolerance, but I knew that I wanted to get good at telling my story. I knew that I wanted to take that time to build that audience from the ground up of not, these are my friends, these are my relatives, these are the people I went to middle school with. These are other teens looking to improve their mental health. These are other people passionate about mental health. These are parents trying to support their kids and have that audience. And I think that's something that's really important to remember as a podcaster, is that most of your community isn't going to be your target audience. Like you don't really necessarily want them to listen to your episodes because they're not being recorded and edited and produced to resonate with them. So it's like you kind of forcing them into, it's like a circle peg into a square hole. Like it just doesn't fit, and that's okay. And so I was very aware of that like forcing all these people to listen to this, like they probably don't want to. This who I'm trying to reach anyway, so that's okay. But a year into it, I did, after doing tons of like cringy like Instagram posts and quotes from the podcast and sharing these episodes, I was really proud of what I'd done, and I shared it with my my general community. And since then, it's just something that I'm so proud of, and I feel like I've gotten good at, that I'm promoting the episodes. I'm like, go look at the account, listen to an episode. Like it's always uncomfortable when people are like, oh, I listened to your podcast episode. I'm like, please don't. I'm like, please do not. Like it's the equivalent, I think, of like when that kid in your middle school like takes up rapping and he's like, listen to my new SoundCloud. I'm like, please don't listen to it. Like I'm so clear that like that is not my target audience. But also it's such a huge part of my identity and what I'm passionate about, and what I care about so deeply, that I'm so happy to spread the reach. But yeah, definitely there's some anxiety. And I got this question recently, like if you have a podcast but you feel like you're not posting as much because you're worried about what people will think. And what I also do is go back to that first reason I started the podcast, which is that if this helps one person, it's so worth it. And yeah, maybe someone will like watch my stories and be like, why is she posting about her heatless curls for the 47th time? No one cares. This is a mental health podcast. But I'm like, you know what? It's fine. I'm doing my thing, and this could be helping one person. And that makes it worth it. And that extra 30 seconds someone is thinking about it doesn't really matter. And especially if you stick with it and you have that consistency, becomes something that people, I don't want to say are jealous of, but they admire. They're like, that's really cool. Like she has done this thing. She's put so much work into it. She has this impact. This is growing. This is cool. All of this kind of stuff. And so at the beginning, it's cringy. I think it's really important to take the time to cultivate your voice and cultivate your message in a way that you're really proud of, and get good at that. But then go back to why you're doing this. Like if it helps one person, then it really doesn't matter, because everyone else is also so concerned about themselves and what they're
Oh,
going through, that like your Instagram story really isn't going to make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. And then once you do continue sticking with it, they're no longer judging your stories. They're like, I wish I had that. Like, why don't I
right.
have a podcast that's getting these downloads, or a platform that is making the world a better place?
Right, that's so true. There's so many things I love what you said. Like it is so interesting. I kind of joke that your friends and family are the first people to listen to it and the first to go. Like they'll be the first to
Yes.
stop to, because yeah, you're right. It's not made for them. And there's an expression of you too, and they know you, and they're kind of like their interests aren't intrigued by it. So like it's okay to let that go.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true of like the online space too. What strikes me so much about your story is that you were really authentic because you were driven by a purpose so early on in your content, when at a time when I kind of feel like we were at the peak of Instagram perfection. And like I think that's
Yeah.
why it's so grounding for you to be where you're at and whatnot, because it was like a tense time on social media, and like things are improving, but like there's always going to be that. It's just like how things that trickle down, like they stay there. It's part of like time and history. Like Instagram's always going to like somewhat an aesthetic, and so I just
Yeah.
love how able you were to do that so early on. I want to go talk about how you were saying, you really make this for teens and, for parents and to help one person. So something I really struggled with, and you are beyond qualified to talk about this, is, knowing kind of like when you needed help or support. Because I personally like had just, I've been struggling with anxiety for so long, and I had generalized anxiety, not to like any extreme state, but I was so young and I didn't know what it was. And I didn't have the language or skill set to ask for help from my parents. And my parents are like the best. They would have if I had vocalized for them. What would be some tools or things you would say to somebody in that space?
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that are important to establish. I think one is that therapy can be helpful to anyone. Therapy doesn't have to be like for me going in and like unpacking your deepest, darkest suicidal ideation and like severe depression. Like now my therapy is like, I really think I'd like to exercise 4 days a week, but I just don't want to do that. How do I get to that point? Or like, what was I talking about yesterday? I was like, I think I should be more social this year. And we like mapped out this like plan, and I was like, gonna bullet journal that, like gonna make
Right?
sure I'm checking in all these things.
It's not the
Um,
movies of like sitting on the
yeah.
couch and crying your eyes out and like
Oh, it
laying
was for
down.
me for a
Oh,
very long time, but it
good.
doesn't have to be.
Right. Or it's not always
Yeah,
that, like
100%.
the
Yeah.
expectations, but continue.
Yeah. No, so therapy can be helpful if you have the right therapist for anything and everything, even if it's just someone in your life that can be a third party where you can get support, you can get that validation, but it doesn't impact your relationship. Like I found even now, like if I'm really upset about something and I like go to my mom, like she'll check in on it 3 days later and be like, how's that thing with your friend going? And I'm like, I've moved past that. I don't want to talk about it. Why are you asking about that again? I am miles away from this challenge. Whereas therapy, it's like you have this person where you can get the support, you can check yourself, you can get the skills education, but then you continue to operate in your relationships in your life in a really effective way. And it's not like you're like, oh, I better go support this person now because I just jumped all of this vulnerability on them. So it's a really great thing. I think it could be helpful for anyone, regardless of what you're struggling with, if you have the right therapist. So with that being said, I think if the question even crosses your mind of like, do I need help? Like, would therapy be helpful? It probably is. Most people that are like functioning well, that question doesn't cross their mind. Like, if they're happy and healthy and living life, they're probably not sitting there like staring at their computer mindlessly, being like, should I look up therapists near me? Like, that's not even crossing their mind, I promise you. So, that's a good indicator. I would also say if you feel like you want to increase or decrease something in your life and you've tried to do it and you haven't seen success. So if you want to, I don't know, get better about your sleep routine, if you want to stop ruminating, if you want to have healthier relationships, if you want to stay more consistent with the schedule and you've tried yourself and you haven't seen a difference, having a therapist support could be really helpful. If you feel like you aren't feeling seen or validated or supported in your relationships, having a therapist could be really helpful. I think we're getting to a point where we're a lot more aware of the symptoms of depression and anxiety and these other mental illnesses and diagnoses. I know when I was so like in blinder mode with what I was experiencing. I was also in 7th and 8th grade. So while I had a vague idea of like mental illness, even though what I was experiencing was like depression to a T, I never really put two and two together until I went to a doctor. And that was really something that my parents initiated. It was really something that they spearheaded. And so having parents, like if parents are listening to this, just keeping an eye on like, what are those warning signs? Is your kid isolating more? Are they changing their relationships a lot? Are they less passionate or interested in the things they used to be? And then getting them support and even just checking in with a pediatrician and being like, can we check on this? I think something might be off. But I would say if anything, if the question is even raised, like, could this be helpful? Maybe I need help. Or if any of those things I mentioned apply to you, like having these symptoms, feeling like you're not feeling seen, feeling like you want to improve something, but it's not working, it's worth giving it a try. It's worth trying therapy. It's worth giving it a shot. And if it doesn't work, if it's not something that's right for you in this moment, that's okay. But there's no harm in trying. And just like I always think it's really important to check these things against physical health because that's where you can really see like stigma showing or your own resistance coming through. Like if you had chronic headaches for months and you didn't go to a doctor, that would be weird. Like, no, you would go to a doctor. You would ask questions. You would get that checked out. Same thing. You are struggling with really low chronic self-esteem, or you're feeling exhausted constantly, or you just are so drained you don't want to interact with anyone. You would go to a doctor and ask questions. I think another thing that is a really big problem is people saying like, oh, but it's not bad enough yet, or I'm not at that point. Like, I don't need that resource. And again, I go back to therapy can be helpful for anyone at any point if you have the right therapist. And there's a really interesting statistic, which is that the kind of like more highly functioning milder cases of mental illness are the ones that last the longest and that take people the longest to get treatment. And so it ends up really being more severe because the people that like hit rock bottom super quickly, they have this huge wave of depression that just comes over them and derails their life. They get treatment pretty quickly. They're able to get support, get help, turn things around. But these people that are functioning with this low level of distress and ineffectiveness for years, let this impact their life, their relationships, their functioning, and don't get help because it's not bad enough yet. And then you see these people who have been suffering for 10 years versus someone suffering for 2, but they were in treatment for part of that and then turn things around. So it's kind of just like reminding yourself, like, okay, maybe it's less bad, but is it really? Like, if you wait 10 years to ask for help, is it really less severe? Is that really not as bad as this other person or this other standard you're holding yourself to? So yeah, I think that's something else that's also important to remember.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally think I fit into that category of that. It wasn't that bad. Like, it wasn't for a really, really long time, but I continued to go through developmental years where and it wasn't until I was 23 that I went into into therapy really consistently.
Yeah.
I love what you say about it's super important to have the right therapist, and I akin it to dating. If you go and
Yes.
it's not right, don't stay.
100%. Yeah, I
Like
had these therapists on my podcast and they were like, you should be therapist shopping. You should be trying things out. You should be not ditching them, sending a nice email saying I'm going to go in a different direction if things aren't working. And the therapist should be doing the same thing as well. If you don't feel like it's a good fit, there's something to be said for like giving it a chance, giving it a certain amount of time because it takes time for the therapeutic relationship to be established. But I know pretty soon going into sessions, like, am I going to vibe with this person or like not at all? And I am guilty of meeting with therapists for months and not really knowing it's not really going to work, but being, yeah, I'll give it a shot. I don't really want to change things. But yeah, no, 100%.
You talk to so you've gone through this amazing journey, but on top of it, I feel like you're only growing your knowledge by talking to so many experts. Like, has there been any, it doesn't have to be like big, or it can be big or small, like things that have been revealed or things you've learned just from doing the podcast?
so many things. And I really do attribute staying stable and being on a good trajectory to the podcast. Like, how many other people that have struggled with depression or anxiety are every single week, like reading a book or interviewing someone or going to psychology classes or making stupid like reels about anxiety coping skills I love. Like, this is, if anything, just keeping me in the right direction and continuing to grow and check myself and just be better at taking care of my own mental health. There's so many things that I've learned during these interviews, and it makes my heart so happy. Like, again, I'm so proud of these conversations that I've had and this resource I've created. I think I did an episode that actually came out this last week with my abnormal psychology professor at Penn, and I learned so much during her class, and it's always fun to now be on the other side of things. Like, she was talking about DBT, she was talking about anxiety and depression and like these treatments they'll try with patients. And I was like, okay, but I was the patient. Like, it's this cool dynamic. But she mentioned this statistic, which is that most of the general population will develop a mental illness at some point in their life. The general statistic is an underestimate because it not only excludes people that are in inpatient or mental health treatment programs, but it also excludes prisons, which, as we know, have a much higher level of mental illness diagnoses. And it also doesn't include people that either haven't gotten a clinical diagnosis because they haven't like pursued help. And it also doesn't include people that have had mental health challenges, but maybe it doesn't meet the criteria for like, oh, it's been 3 months of mental suffering, but it's only been 2. You know what I mean? So not only does everyone have mental health and everyone experiences mental health challenges, but the majority of the population will develop a mental illness at some point in their life. So the people that don't are the minority. That's what's weird. That's what's abnormal. That's when you're like, weird. Are you okay? Like, what are you doing wrong in your life that you're not struggling like the rest of us?
Not you.
So if you're struggling, if you have a diagnosis, if you are in therapy, like, you are the norm. You are what most of us are struggling with and experiencing, because that's just kind of how life works. Like, we go through these insane challenges. We're our own worst enemies. Like, life is hard, and that reflects in the data. So I think that's one thing. There was another quote that has become like really a mantra that I still use from an interview I did with one of the doctors that was in that first inpatient meeting where I was like, parents kicked out, I don't want to be here. And I interviewed him probably 2 or 3 years after that meeting and had him on the podcast. And I asked him, I think it was like your advice for teens that are currently in the depths of it with depression and anxiety. And he said that life is impermanent and that impermanence will be on your side. And if you're like living your best life right now, this quote probably won't appeal to you. You're like, oh, that really sucks. But if you are at your lowest point, if you are struggling, if you are really losing hope, everything in life is impermanent, whether it's a thought, a belief, an emotion, an urge, a relationship, everything is constantly changing. And because of that, this urge, emotion, feeling, depression will lift. It will shift. It has to get better because that's just how the world works. Mm-hmm. And so whenever you're experiencing those lows, they are impermanent, and that impermanent will so be on your side, and it will give, it will shift, it will lift, because that's how the world works. And so I love that. And there's so many other little things that I picked up along the way and just been able to implement in my own life, whether it's like how we like keep anxiety in our bodies. And if we're not exercising enough, you never complete like the stress cycle. Or the idea of like with burnout, sometimes that like signal is like a feather on the shoulder, sometimes it hits you on a rock. So let's listen to the little feather on the shoulder whisper in the ear when our minds or our bodies are telling us things aren't okay. Tips on like how to manage anxiety, how to manage depression, how to have healthier relationships, how to build friendships, self-esteem, confidence, like all of these things that we all want to get better at. I've been able to just learn from the best about on the podcast, which has been really cool.
Oh my gosh. And everybody else can listen in too, which is something I will definitely be doing. Sadie,
but not the early episodes. no one listened to the early episodes.
I know, it's so funny. I was just saying that to another girl I was recording yesterday. I was like, I told myself I would never delete those. And now there's already something that I say in an episode that I'm like, oh, I wish that was God, but you can't beat it up. Yeah.
No, like if you ever look at my podcast catalog and you're like, does she know how to count? There's numbers missing. Those episodes are down for a reason. It's for the best. It's for the best. Most of them, I'm like, okay, I'll come up because I still think there's something in there that maybe could be helpful if you can get over the audio quality and just how bad I was at editing. But like some of them, I was like I remember, it's funny, you mentioned like your parents are the first ones to like listen and then leave.
Mm-hmm.
My parents held on for like the solid first 45 out of like fear for what I was putting on the internet. They were like, we have to listen to these because like she's under 18. We're gonna get sued if something happens. Like, what is happening here? And now I have to beg them to listen. I'm like, this episode was so good. You should look at these teasers I made. And they're like, maybe we're kind of busy. But yeah, no, it's so funny. It's so true. And that's the other thing that I also love to remind podcasters is that so many of these shows that you see like going to the top of the charts or these influencers you see starting podcasts, they're not starting this with no audience. They're not starting this with no experience of public speaking and having a story and talking to an audience. They're not doing their own marketing, their own guest booking, their own editing, their own website, their own PR, like all of these things. Most new podcasters, independent podcasters are doing alone. So it's just not a realistic kind of like example to compare yourself to because it's just a complete different world.
Oh, and I feel that applies to all the digital spaces.
Yes.
Like literally, because like, the huge massive TikTok, because we talk about this all the time, huge massive TikTokers who might have started in their bathroom. Oh, no. They have a camera guy, they have a sound guy, they got their makeup done. Like the range is large. So, I appreciate you acknowledging that. It's very nice to hear.
100%. Yes.
Well, Sadie, you are literally wonderful. Please tell everybody where we can find you and listen to your amazing podcast.
Yeah, so my website is shepersistedpodcast.com. All of the links are there. And if you want to learn more about like DBT or the podcast or all of that kind of stuff is there. And then you can listen to She Persisted wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok at She Persisted Podcast.
Thank you guys so much for listening. And thank you again, Sadie, for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Thank you guys. We'll see you next Tuesday.